It's time for us to begin this evening. If you would like, you can open up your Bibles to the text of Genesis in the very first chapter. That's Genesis chapter 1. We will be paying attention to that text as we work through our conversation and study tonight. Excuse me. Before we do that, though, let's begin our class with prayer. It's a great opportunity to kind of settle ourselves into our Bible study. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we share together in study and reflection. We thank you for the blessings that we find in Jesus. Help us as committed disciples to grow our faith and to understand ourselves, the creation, and our relationship to you and to each other. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in the name of your Son. Amen. How many of you are familiar with the phrase rose-tinted glasses? Everyone kind of know what that phrase means? If you don't know what it means, it's an older phrase. James says that I sometimes use antiquated phrases, and so I try to re-explain them. Like tonight I said, in for a penny, in for a pound. And he's like, what is that about, Dad? I have no idea what that is. I'm like, well, if you're in for a little bit, you're committed for all of it. And so that's what in for a penny, in for a pound means. I had to explain that. So I realized this idea of a rose-tinted glass may be something also that is unique to my background. And so that just simply means that you live in a way that the world out in front of you is one way, but it's like you have glasses that are rose-colored and you see it differently. And sometimes that means you see it nicer. Mostly that's how it's used. But there's also some other phrases of that. So looking at the world through rose-tinted glasses says you don't actually see how it is. You're like living as if everything's better than it really is. A biblical worldview tries to remove those glasses from our eyes and actually see things, firstly, as they actually are. Like really understand legitimately how things are and how they relate to one another. So it's not only taking the glasses off that are distorting your view. And by the way, like modern sunglasses do this with us all the time. They actually affect the yellow and green to lessen the stress of our eyes. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but your UV protected sunglasses, you put them on and your grass all of a sudden goes from a dingy green to a super bright green. You probably have seen that before with a lot of sunglasses. So we're kind of accustomed to it. Well, when you take those off, you realize, oh, my yard doesn't look that good. It's actually more dead than I thought it was. Well, that's kind of how the world can be. Especially when we ask this question, what is a human being? Or to a certain degree, like it says in Psalm chapter 8 and verse 4, what is man? Those are the same question, by the way, just using two different descriptors. So if someone had come to you and said, hey, Steve, what's a person? I'm putting Steve on the spot because they moved to the front row, and I guaranteed he's going to have to interact more. So he almost escaped. So what's your answer to that question? So, hey, what's a person? Like, what is that answer? How would you start to answer that question?
Creation of God.
So, yeah, part of this locks into saying a person is someone, and we say unique because it's a person, a thing, that God made. And so we are created. Now, that doesn't mean that individually God is creating us independent of biology and all those other things, but mankind is created. But is that all we are? Or are we just a created being? Les, what do you got? What would be your part?
God's image.
So yeah, that's a big thing. And pause your brain for a second. When we say we are made in the image of God, we're bringing up the idea that's found in Genesis, right? And we're quoting that. And by the way, it's repeated through the Bible. This made in the image of God imagery reoccurs. But we have to pause and say, well, what does that mean? Created, I can fathom that. I can kind of put that, okay, it says in our Genesis text that God formed man out of dust, and my brain has a version of what I think that looks like. And your brain has a version of what you think that looks like, right? Because whenever you say that, all of a sudden you start going, okay. But to be made in the image of God is a wider thing. Because we have to ask, what does that mean to be made in the image of God? And what does that actually teach me or tell me? So, and I'll say this real quickly, there's probably not one single edge to this. There's a couple of different corners to what it means to be made in the image of God. Bobby?
God gave us a soul that will never die.
So now, and this may even connect to our idea of an image bearer, that we've got something unique and immortal, never die, that makes us different than other things he's made. Do we have similarity with animal kind genetically? We actually have quite a bit, right? They can take some of our organs. I don't know how they do it. I know that they can. And they can help them regrow damaged organs from a living person by attaching it to a critter, and it heals up and they put it back in. I don't understand how that works. I just know they can. And they do a lot of other procedures that are similar to that because we have a similarity. But that similarity isn't same. We have similarity to all of the various types of created living creatures. Similarity because of the structure of our bodies, the way cellular systems function, all that stuff. They're very similar, but not the same. But the key distinction is one that Bobby has pointed out, is that there's an additional qualifier that makes man uniquely separate from animal kind, avian kind, fish kind, plant kind, or however you want to classify, in that we have a soul. And in the text, it uses this phrase that pops up in the Bible a lot too, that God did something to man to make that happen. He breathed what into him? Life. And he uses, that's a different process than how he made all the other stuff. The other stuff just occurred. But there's something about man, that says life is breathed in, that has us arrive at this level of God-spaced artistry, that now we have man being not only similar to all the other stuff God has made, but now unique in that we are made in his image. And in that text, by the way, when we read that in Genesis 1, you'll note that being made in the image of God, however we understand it, is inclusive of something that's special, that's going to reoccur a lot in chapter 2 and chapter 3, in that male and female he created them. Now there's a second creation narrowing that happens after that, where a little bit more of the male-female creation process is kind of sourced out there. But now we have this thing that says being an image bearer of God, or being made in the image of, somehow includes the distinction of male and female. We're not sure about it yet because maybe we haven't defined it or it's complicated, but it makes us different than everything else. That's important to know because think of it this way. When you see another person somewhere, do you immediately determine some things about them? I realize this, you absolutely do. How many times do you think I get asked the question, hey, did you play basketball? What do you think the rate of question that is in my life? Is that a low question or a very common question for me? I'll put Les on the spot. Les, do you get asked that question a lot when you were throughout your life? Why do you think that I get asked that question and you don't get asked that question?
Difference in our height.
Difference in our height makes us different, and people judge that right away, right? And I don't care. My answer to that question is no, I played miniature golf. I did play basketball, but that's my answer to that question because I also played miniature golf. Because it doesn't matter to me, but when we see a person, we've got to train ourselves to see more than our height or our age or even perhaps our gender or perceptions about our worth or value. Because if we see a human being, the root basis of that is that they are made in the image of God. And I love getting that kind of as a standard there. Here's the second thing that's kind of similar to it. When Paul is writing to the Christians at Corinth who are fussing and fighting like no tomorrow, he says, remember, this is your brother for whom the Lord died. He's telling them, stop looking at them as if the person you have a problem with is there, and reframe your brain to say, Jesus died for them too. The same principle is back in Genesis where you say, that person bears the image of God. And that's as wide a net as it can be. That's every single living human being you will meet in life, that's them. So if you meet someone who has any kind of physical deformities because of genetic things when they were born, they're made in the image of God. If you meet someone who looks like no person you've ever seen on the planet, they too are made in the image of God. So whatever that idea means, it absolutely doesn't have anything to do with our flesh. Because our flesh can be all the possibilities, and the answer is still, they're made in the image of God. And we'll talk about this later when we talk about sexuality and identity, but that would even include those who are the rare genetic possibilities of like XYY, XXY, and all the different chromosomal combines. They're not new. The Bible actually has, over the years, dealt with these things. They are too made in the image of God. And every other possibility, you think about it right now, someone who has a unique physical history, they're the same. That's the root of our picture of being formed or fashioned in the image of God. Now, how well we chew on that, swallow it, and make it part of who we are, does that change how you see things in life? If you see somebody and you go, that's an image bearer of God, or you see somebody and say, that's my enemy, right? The better we get to the image bearer side, we might be better at interacting with the creation better. That's kind of the goal of our, the thesis of our class tonight, is to really reflect on what it means to have a humanity as a group and individuals who are carrying God's image in some way, whatever that fully means. And I keep saying it that way because while there are some crystal clear premises of what it means to carry the image of God, the way that it's written, it's not precise. It doesn't give us a 10-point list. It's an idea as opposed to this whole specific box. So we've got to be careful with our words to allow some space for, I don't know. My ignorance has to be there. Bobby?
God also created us with a seed to reproduce after our own kind.
Yeah, and that actually fits in the narrative space of the creation account, right? Because everything else is getting that same kind of reproductive possibility. They all have the capacity of seed. And let me ask this question. In Genesis 1, 2, and 3, does the terminology of a seed come up again? Whose seed will be blessed? The seed of woman. And what will the seed of woman do? It'll crush the head of the serpent / the devil. Different terms are used in different parts of the Old Testament text and the New Testament text. So these pictures that begin with telling us about creation in a way we can understand it, because that's what that creation account is. It says it's basically God made it. Here it is. But realize he's telling us about something that is baffling. I've got an illustration of that that's in context in a second.
He also made us God has dominion over everything, but he made man have dominion over all living things, creatures, plants. We have the dominion and the control to be used to our benefit and to be able to control them where none of those beings have the intelligence to control us.
Right, there is a hierarchy in creation and responsibility because of that that's shown, that's part of man. Man, this is your job. You have a role to fill. And no, that's in the garden. And man did not do good with that job. At some point, we failed. Mankind did in Adam and Eve. And they got expelled. They had new jobs afterwards that were cursed to be worse than their old jobs. So I want you to think about this. When you read the creation account, which is surrounding our human arrival thing, and it says, God said, let there be light, and there was light. It's only a recent understanding from humankind to know that light has mass. It's got physical, properties. Now, for my limited brain, I'm kind of baffled by that. I accept the observation that they've made. I think it makes sense in the scientific journals I've read. But I was thinking about this in the sense of creation. So when I turn on a light switch, this is how it functions for my little pea brain, right? Boom, light's immediate there, right? Like the minute the light happened there, I acknowledged it in my eyeballs. What's the speed of light approximately? Pick a number, you're probably right. My answer is super fast, right? And physics tells me that the closer you get to the speed of light, your perception of time slows down. That's what the physicists say when they try to describe it. Then I know that it's really far from the sun to the earth, right? That's the accurate term, right? Really far? Like a lot of distance from the sun to the earth based on our observations of solar mechanics and the dynamics of our solar system. Well, God made light, and when he made light there and every spot in between at the volume, amount, and necessity to have all of that there so that light that was at the sun is also light that was on the earth at the garden and everything else in between. And so that's why I say, this is important to pay attention to, that the creation account is taking an amazingly, beautifully complex cosmos and giving it to us in sentences. So just accept the fact that there's a lot going on that we just get to accept. And that's not part of our need, because there's a different need in the story than God made. Understanding who you are as part of the creation is not only as important as knowing that God made you, probably more important to know about these relationships. Because immediately God takes these created people, like Bobby pointed out, and like we've kind of noted and Les has pointed out as well, and puts them in the garden, gives them relationship to each other, gives them a relationship to God, and gives them a relationship in the broader sense of tending for the garden, even subordinate to other spiritual entities that we don't even know how they get to be. Well, note that in Genesis, we don't get this big origin story for all the other spiritual beings. That includes, at this point, the devil. And linguistically, in some of these creation accounts, it seems like he's not alone. So he's got a herd of similarly minded creatures. But we don't get told where that all comes from, because that's not the point. Man is actually the center point of that side of the story, where God is the heart of it. It's the center of the garden and the center of the experience. Now, have you ever heard the phrase, well, I'm only human? You ever said that sometimes? I think we've all kind of felt it. We're expressing our limitations, that there's something about being in the flesh that we accept, that failure sometimes feels like it's not just an option, it's the default. Like, all right, well, I'm going to try that, it's not going to go well. There was even a song that was popular a few years back that had a similar lyric line, something like, "I'm only human born to make mistakes." And I'll tell you, I can resonate with that. A lot of my learning in life has taken place because I did something dumb. Someone says, "Hey, that's dumb." And I go, "Yeah, that was dumb." And I try not to do it again. I get a little smarter and I go, "God said this was dumb." And I try to avoid it on the first end. But early on, that's how I learned. That's kind of how most of us learn at times. But that's the thing that's important for us to catch, because that's looking at the world with the world's goggles on. They see man, and they see man being innately a failure. And yet that's not actually the case. We're actually built to make a successful transition from this life to the next. And we get to choose whether we're going to be successful or not. We have the choice to say, "I will stick with God, who is gracious and forgiving," or "I will reject him." And the story of God's people are the ones who want to stay. God cares for them, protects them. Even when it's bad, he still goes and rescues them. Even when they're super dumb, God is faithful and calls them back. And so the picture there doesn't really match the earthly perspective about humankind. This is not a theological thing where you're saying, "Well, are you saying we can't fall away?" Absolutely you can. You can choose to. We're saying God is gracious and he's willing to wait, and he does. Those are two separate kind of ideals. So think about this for a moment. Kind of pause and reflect on it. In the Psalms, I mentioned this already, in Psalm chapter 8 and in verse 4, the psalmist, David, asks a question. Because if we've defined man as being physical, yet more, spiritual, eternal, because of a soul, and made in God's image, then when David asks this question, "What is man that you are mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you care about him or for him?" David's asking the deeper side of our question that was academic, what's a human being? He's saying, what's so special about me that God cares about me? So let's ask that question. I've got an answer. I've hinted at what that would be in some ways. But what do you think the answer to this question should be? That why is it that God cares about mankind, humankind, or individually, you and me? How might you answer that question? By the way, it's an important question.
I guess you could sum it up by saying because he made us in his own image.
That's my answer.
Rich, what you got?
Very good. Very good. So I was thinking of it in the sense of the context of what David's asking about. So he's looking at the stars and the heavens and all of the expanse and the things that are around him and the majesty in which it displays. And then he's like, what am I? What are we? Why do you care for us? And the whole spectrum of what you've created. And then comes back to Les's point, right? So
Yeah.
he cares for us, right? He loved us so much, he sent his only son. And he loved us so much because we're made in his image.
Yeah. You know, I resonate well with the psalmist David here when he says, "Why? Like, it feels like God who can take his hand and scratch upon the surface of the earth to create the valleys and the mountains." Because that's the poetic force of these terms. And then he looks at me. Like, what am I in that compared to all of creation? What am I in the grand scope of the cosmos? How do I compare to the aurora borealis? I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of that. It's just an amazing kind of atmospheric, opportunity up in the way north sections of our country. How do I compare to that? Like, look at me. I'm none of those things, and yet God cares about me and you. So understanding that component And getting to that point of recognizing, okay, well, he cares about us at such a deep level because we do bear an image and we do have a relationship potential with him. Our relationship begins at our own inception or creation, and we determine what it's like. You want to know how to have a good relationship with someone? Invest in it. You want to know how to have a bad relationship with someone? Don't. Like, that's basically the metric. There's not really super complicated after that. Because we seem so insignificant and frail in sight of all these other things. And by the way, in the New Testament, the same thing comes up. This is in Luke chapter 12 and verses 6 and 7, where Jesus is now our speaker. And he says, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? And not one of them is forgotten before God. Why, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows." Do you think about that for a second? Like, where do I sit on the sparrow scale when we think about things that matter? How many of you have accidentally taken a small animal out of this life?
Yeah.
The answer is probably you have. Especially if we start talking about the living organisms known as bacteria. Because many of us want to take all of those things out of our lives as much as we can, right? They're kind of alive, right? We understand that they're a living thing, that they're not sentient, but they're alive. We crush them all the time. We don't think it's worth that much. Would you cry if someone killed a sparrow? I mean, I might if it was in my yard. You know, I've got pretty attached to these dumb deer that live in my backyard. You know, that like, I could still eat them if I had to. I'm not that far along, but they're my deer now. They're not, but they're my deer. They're my dear friends, all 5 of them that come in. All right? But I know that in the hierarchy of things, they're just a creature that is interesting to watch. And yet God uses a sparrow to both elevate and humble. So man, now who is an image bearer of God, and all the little edges of that meaning comes into play, is of more value than a sparrow that's offered in sacrifice, by the way. So much so that my hair, whatever is still residing up upon my noggin, and whatever was there before, he says it's numbered. Now, I actually suggest to you, I don't think what Jesus is saying is literal in that way. He's saying he knows you that well. He's so intimate with your existence that he knows the follicles that are on your body. But we already established that's not what makes us us. What's another way that the New Testament describes our body? What are some of the phrases in the scriptures that say this is your person? A tent. How many of you have camped in a cheap tent? That's an exciting experience for a little while, right? And then it's not. Because those cheap tents, they fail pretty quickly when the wind picks up and you're out there stacking rocks trying to hold part of it down and you're bringing rocks inside. I don't know if you've gotten that desperate, but I have, to keep your tent in place, in addition to the guidelines and everything. But a tent or a tabernacle, which is another phrase that appears in different translations, is a temporary thing. It's not permanent. What do we treat our bodies like, though? I think we actually do 2 things with them. We pretend that they're temples, right? We act like they're so super important verbally, but I think we actually treat our bodies like tents. We discard them pretty quickly. We don't think well about our flesh very much, not always for the right reasons, and sometimes for the right reasons. But we never really get to the point where we acknowledge that actually this body is kind of a temple too. We don't get there like we should. And it's only a temple. What lives in a temple? Do lowly scum live in temples? No, gods live in temples, right? And that's weird because are you a god? There's an easy answer to that question. The answer should be no, right? I am not a god. But do you have an inheritance that's unduly given to you? I'm not a god, but I have the inheritance of a god. I am an adopted son, an adopted brother, and I've been granted entrance into a temple. Now, that's where the garden is a temple picture. But I live right now in a temporary temple, and my body houses something extraordinary. And he says, inside of you, you've got something that is on the edge of divine because you carry God's image inside of you. I've used this illustration before, and especially now that my mother-in-law is not in the audience, I can get a little more careful about it and more precise because she might be listening. I'll probably get in trouble. But I'm willing to accept that. For a long time, after Jill and I were married, I was not allowed to touch the gravy boat. All right? There's two reasons for that. The first reason is, how much gravy do you think I'm going to pour out on my stuff? Snorkel levels, right? Okay, that's number one. Number two is my giant hands aren't built for a lot of things in life. And delicate things, and these ginormous little fingers here, we're not friends. I break stuff. I drop stuff. If you ever get an accidental phone call from me, it's because my giant hands can't work the phone just right. So just accept that reality. Well, I wasn't allowed to touch it because that gravy boat, while it's not super family heirloom, it's not an amazing one of a kind on the planet, she cared about it. And so she wisely and astutely recognized that I shouldn't be the one touching it because what's in it and what it is matters. Kind of like how we need to re-envision ourselves and say, wait a minute, my flesh matters, it does, but not a lot, but it does. It profits a little, Paul says in his letters. And it certainly is important for us to keep it up spiritually and physically, all that. But what matters is what's inside it, right? The inside of the gravy boat is all I care about. I don't care about the gravy boat that much. And the inside of you, metaphorically, which is your soul, that's what we should be caring about, right? The inner part of you. That's the thing that actually makes man, wait for it, man. Because in absence of a soul, the story stops right there. Because what does man figure out very quickly? Man with a soul looks at all creation, going back to our Genesis 1 reading and our Genesis 2 reading. Hey, look, I've looked at all these creatures, and there's nothing else like me out here. And the only difference is his soul. What makes man man is that inner quality of a being that we call sometimes the spirit, the soul, or our status as bearers or carriers of the image of God, and all that would kind of extensively entail. There's a part of this then that has us in a first order type of relationship. As an image bearer who is slated to have the option to receive the inheritance, we actually get responsibilities that go in the garden and afterwards. In the garden, what are the responsibilities? Pretty simple. It's a single phrase. Tend the garden, whatever that meant. And remember, God made the garden, and he made the gardeners, and everything was fine, all right? Post-garden, we had new responsibilities. We had some obligations that shifted, curses, childbirth, whatever it was before, now worse. Because that's how it's written out. And weeds start becoming part of our life. Weeds are just the pest to my existence and maybe yours. Doesn't matter what you do, they're coming back. There's no permanent solution to them. And that's just part of creation as it stands post-garden. So we still have a similar relationship in this big picture, but we're expected now to become good stewards of what we have. And that's all still part of our being an image bearer, because think about this. God cares for us in as much as we care for the creation that's still entrusted to us. That relationship didn't change because a law was instituted independent of the big picture. The law of Moses was Israel specific. God's expectation for creation was boundless to all of it, whatever extent he had in mind. I don't know if you heard this. Isaac Watts has a song. It goes this way. I sing the goodness of the Lord that filled the earth with food. He formed the creatures with his word and then pronounced them good. Lord, how thy wonders are displayed where'er I turn my eye, if I survey the ground I tread or gaze upon the sky. As image bearers who are wandering around the big garden, earth, this relationship still exists. I don't know if you noticed this. It's a great little point to include when we think about mankind and seeds. The reproductive aspect of man is also linked to the death of man. It's a cycle that exists going forth from the garden. In Paul's writing in the church at Corinth, he used that same seed picture to talk about our potential future. And he says that you have to die in order to be born again. And that's to people who are already in Christ, who've already died in the grave of baptism. But there may be a moment where they're going to die again. That death there is linked to the death of Christ, right? In Paul's writing. And I think it's always neat to notice this detail. When they go see and look for the Christ and they see him, who do they think he is? They perceived him to be whom by job? I thought he was the gardener. Now think for a moment. The first Adam, who was a gardener, the last Adam is mistaken for being a gardener. And it is the last Adam who is the seed that emanated from the garden that's planting the tree of our own immortality. It's a great biblical picture being unfurled in all of that. And it comes to its fullness when we acknowledge who man is. We're not just dumb beasts. We have control of our will. We have control of our choices. Remember that the next time you're struggling in your behavior, when you say, like Adam did, the woman thou gavest me, she caused me to sin. That was a lie, by the way. Because he says, well, she gave me the food and I just ate it. Like, you're lying. Like, you wanted it, you desired it, you knew you shouldn't be eating it. You're covering your sins. We do that too. Well, if that police officer hadn't been there, then I wouldn't have gotten pulled over for speeding. Like, you know what? If you hadn't been speeding, you wouldn't have needed, like, we're the problem, right? Or you can say, like, oh, if my boss who pays me and, like, you know, provides me a job wasn't so cantankerous, do you ever think that he's cantankerous because he's been dealing with you for so long? And I say that as a person who was the problem, and sometimes who was the boss who was the problem. Because we have the power, because we bear the image of God, to choose. To have that will. And I think that's a powerful aspect of how we see everything else. How many of you eat regularly enough at Chick-fil-A to know kind of how their customer service works? What's the thing they say when they come in or you talk to them? What's their phrase they're required to say? My pleasure, right? Now, it's not always their pleasure, but they're made to say that. They create this culture. And Other places do not say that to you when you go in. Now, they may not believe it, but I will tell you, as the recipient of those statements, when that Chick-fil-A worker says, "My pleasure," kind of feels all right. Because they've acknowledged my existence, and they gave me my chicken hot, ready, and fast, just like I like it. And it's the same all the time, and it's generally pretty good. Because my needs are low order, like hot, served on time, and good, cleanly work environment. But that's kind of like low status right there. They are trained to do that corporate culture-wise on the principle that when you see a customer come in, you don't know what's happened to them that day. They actually have that as part of their employee onboarding training, where they teach you how to see a person as a person and not a problem. So they have this whole big video montage where they talk about, here's this one person here, and she looks really upset, but actually she just lost her husband. And you don't know that. She just looks upset. And so they teach their employees high-level customer service in very simple ways. That's very biblical, right? Because when you see someone and they're having a bad day, you don't know why they're having a bad day. In fact, you actually don't even know if they're having a bad day. Because until you know someone, you probably aren't doing a great job of reading their nonverbals. Do you know that we have this like whole face space that actually tells people how we feel? And like, if you know someone really well, you're like, how you doing? If someone asks you that question and they know you really well, they're politely saying, I know you're having a bad day. When you're ready, tell me. Because they already know. They can look at your face and go, yeah, it's not good. Your day's not great. Like, you're not doing really well. I can see you're in pain. I can see you're hurting. I can see you're exhausted. And the reminder for all of us is to kind of lean into this idea that being a human being is connecting all those dots together to realize that our flesh is a window into who we are. But it is not who we are. We are spiritual beings who bear the image of God, who are designed kind of like an envelope that has the return to sender. We're built to go back. He wants us to go back. And that will shift how a lot of the way we see ourselves and others. And I think it's foundational and something we probably already know. A lot of these principles aren't new to us, but we package them together and say, this is our world. Now we have a mechanism to understand complicated issues. Like I mentioned before, like human sexuality is a complicated issue, especially understanding that there is some physicality issues that we'll have to talk about, and those will be in a couple weeks. We'll have that discussion in this class. And like, why are we moral? And why do morals actually function? And even doubt is a function of our understanding of this kind of foundational principle. We've got like 10 seconds or less. So any last comments? Because that's all you get. The clock just said so we're stopping here. Next week will be our singing night, and I'll have more to say about that during our closing announcements. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your participation tonight.